It was 6:43 p.m. on a Tuesday when four SUVs rolled up to my barn like some kind of suburban invasion force. The drivers, all wearing matching baby blue polos with embroidered clipboards on the chest, surrounded my property entrance while shouting about unauthorized fencing and livestock density thresholds. They had laminated badges hanging from lanyards and carried tablets like they were auditing the Pentagon. What they hadn't noticed was my brother Jake standing in the shadows of the barn, shirtless and holding a shovel after helping me dig a new drainage ditch all afternoon. Jake, 6 feet 4 inches with arms like tree trunks and a 5 o'clock shadow that could sand wood, had done 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine. He stepped into the fading sunlight, and I watched one woman's clipboard slip from her fingers and hit the dirt. A man in khakis actually took 3 steps backward and muttered something that sounded like, "Oh no, not again." Jake's voice was calm as a still pond when he asked them if they were lost. The lead woman, who I'd later learned called herself President Patricia Holbrook of the Pine Ridge Estates, HOA, tried to puff up her chest and declare they were conducting an official inspection. Jake just smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Let me back up and explain how 4 delusional suburbanites ended up trembling in my driveway about to learn that impersonating a government authority on private property comes with serious consequences. My name is Tom Morrison, and I'm a 42-year-old software developer who got tired of the city grind. 3 years ago, I bought 20 acres in Meatfield County, a rural area where the nearest neighbor is 4 mile away, and the only traffic jams involve actual cows. The property came with an old farmhouse, a barn that needed work, and absolutely zero HOA restrictions. According to every legal document I'd reviewed with my lawyer, I turned the place into my personal paradise. Solar panels on the barn roof, a chicken coop with about 30 happy hens for goats that kept the grass trimmed, and a vegetable garden that would make any homesteader jealous. The peace and quiet were exactly what I'd been searching for after 20 years of corporate cubicles and traffic. That peace shattered when Patricia Holbrook moved to the area 6 months ago. She'd bought a McMansion about 2 miles down the road and immediately decided that the entire county needed her special brand of organization. Patricia was a 55-year-old former corporate efficiency expert with steel gray hair in a helmet-like cut and a wardrobe consisting entirely of pastel blazers. She had the demeanor of someone who'd been hall monitor in elementary school and never quite got over the power trip. Within weeks of arriving, Patricia had printed business cards declaring herself president of the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The only problem was that Pine Ridge Estates didn't exist. There was no HOA. There were no estates, just scattered rural properties with people who'd specifically chosen this area to avoid exactly this kind of nonsense. But Patricia didn't let reality slow her down. She recruited 3 accomplices from her book club. There was Harold, a retired insurance adjuster who wore transition lenses and carried a measuring tape everywhere. Nancy, a former PTA president who'd been voted out for trying to implement a dress code for parent-teacher conferences. And Kevin, a guy in his 30s who still lived with his mother and spent his days monitoring neighborhood social media groups for code violations in towns he didn't even live in. Together, they formed what Patricia called the Pine Ridge Estates Beautification and Standards Committee. They had a website, matching polos, and a 70-page document outlining acceptable mailbox heights, approved fence colors, and grass length requirements. None of it was legal. None of it was enforceable. But that didn't stop them from leaving notices on people's doors and sending strongly worded emails about compliance. Most folks just ignored them or laughed it off. A few told them where they could stick their laminated notices. But Patricia was convinced she just needed one big win to establish her authority. She chose my farm as her target, probably because she'd driven by and seen my solar panels glinting in what she considered an aggressive manner. The harassment started small. First came a letter on official-looking letterhead informing me that my chicken coop exceeded the recommended square footage for auxiliary structures. I used it as kindling for my fire pit. Then came the email about my fence posts being 4 in taller than the community standard. I marked it as spam. The voicemail about my goats being a potential noise hazard got deleted without a second thought. But Patricia didn't give up easily. She escalated to what she called compliance visits. She'd show up with her crew, measure things, take photos, and leave notices about violations of their made-up rules. I'd gotten good at spotting their SUVs coming down the road and making myself scarce until they gave up and left. This time was different. This time, my brother Jake was visiting. Jake had just gotten out of the Marines after 12 years of service. He was staying with me for a few weeks while he figured out his next move. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy for him. Loud noises made him jumpy, crowds made him anxious, and people trying to assert authority over him when they had no right to do so made him very, very focused. So, when Patricia and her crew rolled up that Tuesday evening, boxing in my truck with their vehicles and marching toward my barn like they owned the place, Jake was already on edge from a day of hard physical labor. He'd been helping me dig a drainage ditch in the summer heat, and his patience for nonsense was at absolute zero. I was in the barn checking on the chickens when I heard car doors slamming and Patricia's shrill voice declaring that this was an official inspection. Through the window, I watched a crew fan out across my property entrance, tablets at the ready like some kind of discount SWAT team. Harold had his measuring tape out and was already documenting the distance between my fence posts. Nancy was photographing my compost bin with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. Kevin was flying a drone over my vegetable garden. Patricia herself marched straight toward the barn, waving a thick folder and shouting about agricultural density violations and non-permitted structures. She was so focused on her performance that she walked right past Jake, who'd been taking a water break in the shade. My brother set down his water bottle very carefully. He straightened up to his full height, rolled his shoulders back, and stepped out into the light. The movement was so smooth and deliberate that it immediately caught everyone's attention. Harold's measuring tape went slack. Nancy lowered her camera. Kevin's drone wobbled in the air. Patricia spun around and found herself looking up at Jake. Way up. My brother had that thousand-why stare that comes from years of assessing threats in hostile territory. His voice was perfectly level when he spoke, which somehow made it more unsettling. He asked if they had a warrant. Patricia tried to stammer something about HOA authority. Jake asked again if they had a warrant. She thrust her folder at him, declaring it contained all necessary documentation. Jake took the folder, flipped through it for about 3 seconds, then handed it back. He informed her that forged documents weren't warrants and that impersonating a government authority was a felony. Patricia tried to argue that they weren't impersonating anyone, that they were a legitimate homeowners association. Jake pulled out his phone and started recording, asking her to repeat that statement for the camera. That's when things got interesting. Kevin tried to fly his drone closer to record Jake recording them. Jake calmly informed him that flying a drone over private property without permission was illegal and that flying one over livestock was a federal crime. Kevin's hands started shaking on the controls. The drone dipped dangerously close to the chicken coop. Nancy tried to de-escalate by explaining they were just trying to maintain property values. Jake asked whose property values since this was agricultural land with no HOA jurisdiction. Harold chimed in about community standards. Jake asked him to show the legal documentation establishing these standards. Nobody could produce anything legitimate because nothing legitimate existed. I finally emerged from the barn. Partly because I was worried Jake might scare them into cardiac arrest, and partly because I wanted to enjoy the show. Patricia immediately redirected her attention to me, waving her folder and declaring I was in violation of 16 different codes. I asked her which governing body had established these codes. She said the Pine Ridge Estates HOA. I informed her there was no such entity registered with the county or state. That's when Patricia made her biggest mistake. She declared that if there wasn't an HOA, then she was establishing one right now under the authority of concerned citizens. She actually tried to serve me with what she called founding documents, demanding I sign them or face immediate fines. Jake had heard enough. He pulled out his phone again, but this time he wasn't recording. He called 911 and calmly reported that 4 individuals were on private property, refusing to leave, impersonating government officials and attempting to extort money through fraudulent fines. He provided our address and a clear description of the situation while Patricia's face went from red to purple to a concerning shade of white. Within 15 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. By this point, Patricia's crew had retreated to their vehicles, but they'd boxed themselves in with their own parking job. The deputies recognized the situation immediately. Apparently, this wasn't the first complaint they'd received about Patricia's fake HOA. Deputy Richards, a veteran officer with 30 years on the force, took one look at Patricia's documentation and shook his head. He explained that impersonating a government authority was a Class D felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Creating fraudulent legal documents was another felony. Attempting to collect fines under false pretenses was fraud. Flying a drone over agricultural land without permission violated several federal regulations. Patricia tried to argue that they were just concerned citizens trying to improve the community. Deputy Richards asked if concerned citizens usually wore matching uniforms and carried badges. She claimed they were identification badges, not official badges. He asked to see her driver's license to compare it to her laminated HOA president badge while Deputy Richards dealt with Patricia. Deputy Chen interviewed the rest of us. Kevin immediately admitted that the drone was his and that he'd been documenting properties for their database. When asked what gave him the right to surveil private property, he mumbled something about community standards and then asked if he needed a lawyer. Harold tried to claim he was just along for the ride, but his measuring tape and notebook full of violation codes suggested otherwise. Nancy broke down crying, saying Patricia had assured her everything was legal and above board. She pulled out her phone to show the deputy their website, which featured photos of dozens of properties with detailed violation lists. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia had created an elaborate fake organization complete with a website, uniforms, badges, and official-looking documents. She'd been systematically harassing property owners, demanding compliance with non-existent rules, and threatening fines she had no authority to impose. The drone footage on Kevin's tablet showed they'd been surveilling multiple properties without permission. Jake stood back and watched it all unfold with a satisfied expression of a man who just won a battle without throwing a single punch. He'd later tell me it was the most entertainment he'd had since leaving the service. Deputy Richards placed Patricia under arrest for impersonating a government official, fraud, and criminal trespassing. Kevin was cited for multiple drone violations and trespassing. Harold and Nancy were charged with criminal trespassing and conspiracy to commit fraud. The matching polos that had seemed so official an hour earlier now looked like prison uniforms in waiting. As Patricia was led to the deputy's car in handcuffs, she kept insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that she was trying to help the community, that property values would plummet without enforcement of standards. Deputy Richards informed her she could explain all that to a judge. The story made the local news the next day. Channel 7 ran a segment called Fake HOA Busted by Fed Up Farmers. The reporter interviewed several other property owners who'd been harassed by Patricia's group. Turns out they'd collected over $40,000 in fines from elderly residents who didn't know any better. That turned a simple fraud case into a major felony investigation. Patricia's mugshot became a meme in our county. Someone photoshopped her holding a sign that said, "I fought the farm and the farm won." Her Pine Ridge Estates website was taken down as evidence. The matching polos ended up as evidence, too. 3 months later, the case went to trial. Patricia was found guilty on all charges. The judge, who happened to own a small farm himself, was not sympathetic to her claims of trying to improve the community. He sentenced her to 3 years in prison, 5 years probation, and ordered her to pay restitution of $120,000 to her victims. When the sentence was read, Patricia's jaw dropped open, and she actually asked the judge if he knew what this would do to property values. The judge replied that he certainly hoped it would keep them affordable for actual farmers.